When a racist cop harasses a black mother in front of her children, things seem hopeless. But in an unexpected twist, a mysterious billionaire witnesses the scene, and his response changes everything for the officer, the mother, and the entire community. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines. It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon for Shanice. She had just buckled her kids, 6-year-old Ava and 8-year-old Malik, into the back of her SUV after a visit to an upscale neighborhood. They had spent the day with family friends, and now, the car was packed with toys, leftover food, and laughter still hanging in the air. Shanice was about to get behind the wheel when a police cruiser rolled up behind her, flashing lights reflecting off her rearview mirror. Officer Harden, a gruff, middle-aged cop, got out, glaring at her as though she'd committed a crime by simply existing. License and registration, he barked, voice clipped and eyes scanning her like a predator sizing up prey. Shanice hadn't even started the car yet. Her heart raced. This wasn't a routine stop, it felt like an ambush. Harden's questions weren't just routine, they were dripping with contempt. "What are you doing here? Is this your car?" His tone twisted the words, as if a black woman driving an SUV in this neighborhood was a crime in itself. His gaze flicked toward the backseat, where Ava sat frozen, her small hands gripping her stuffed rabbit like it was a lifeline. Malik, old enough to sense something was wrong, leaned forward slightly, eyes wide, trying to make sense of the tension. Neither of them understood why this man in a uniform, someone they'd been taught to trust, was treating their mother like a criminal. Shanice took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She didn't want to scare the kids any more than they already were. "We're visiting a family friend," she explained calmly, her voice steady but tight, like a taut wire about to snap. But Harden wasn't listening. Her words were hitting a wall of prejudice, bouncing off the hard armor of assumptions he'd made the moment he saw her skin color. He stepped closer, his body looming over hers, fingers twitching dangerously near his holster, as if her existence alone was enough to justify violence. "A family friend? Here," he sneered, his voice rising with each word, making it clear he didn't believe her. He wasn't just asking questions, he was interrogating her, looking for a reason, any reason, to justify what he was already thinking. His eyes scanned the car again, lingering on the kids, as if even they were part of some grand conspiracy. Shanice felt the knot in her stomach tighten painfully, a mix of humiliation and fear wrapping around her like a vice. She'd been through this before, different day, different place, same story. No matter how well she spoke, how much she explained, she could see in Harden's eyes that she didn't belong here. Not to him. She wasn't just a suspect, she was an intruder in his world. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out her ID, forcing herself to keep her head up as she handed it to him. But Harden barely glanced at the card. He wasn't interested in her name or where she lived. His gaze lingered on her face, full of judgment, as though the ID was just a formality, a box to check before he made his next move. The hostility hung thick in the air, suffocating, and Shanice could feel her children's eyes on her, watching every second, seeing the way this stranger was treating their mom. She knew this moment would stay with them, etching itself into their memories, a painful lesson about the world they lived in. The unfairness of it all made her blood boil, but the fear for her kids kept her silent, playing the role of the cooperative suspect just to keep them safe. Harden's questions weren't just routine, they were dripping with contempt, every syllable curled with disdain. "What are you doing here? Is this your car?" He emphasized your as if the very idea of Shanice owning something nice was absurd. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. His tone didn't leave room for explanations, only suspicions. His narrowed eyes flicked over her, appraising her as though her mere presence was an offense. His gaze drifted toward the backseat, landing on Ava, who was now gripping her stuffed rabbit so tightly that its fur was matted between her fingers. Her wide eyes darted between the strange man in the uniform and her mother, silently pleading for some sense of normalcy to return. Malik, more aware of the world's ugliness than his sister, leaned forward just enough to catch a glimpse of Harden's sneering face. His young mind was spinning, trying to reconcile this scene with what he'd been taught in school, that police were there to help people. But this man wasn't here to help. Shanice's heart raced, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly. She could feel the weight of her children's eyes on her, and the last thing she wanted was for them to see her fear. "We're visiting a family friend," she said, her voice measured and calm, though she felt anything but. The effort to stay composed was like balancing on a tightrope, every word she spoke stretching thinner, threatening to snap. But Hardin wasn't listening. His ears were deaf to anything that didn't align with his preconceived notions, and Shanice could see it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his fingers twitched near his holster, as if just her standing there was enough to justify pulling it. "A family friend? Asterisk here asterisk," he scoffed, his voice dripping with disbelief. He took another step forward, his shadow falling over her. The mocking tone made it clear, he didn't believe her. He didn't even care to try. To him, her story was irrelevant. She was irrelevant. His eyes swept over her children again, cold and calculating, like they were part of some criminal conspiracy he was ready to dismantle. His stare lingered on Malik, as if daring the boy to say something, to make a sudden move. It was in that moment Shanice realized this man wasn't here to ask questions, he was hunting for a reason to escalate the situation. He was looking for a justification to turn this encounter into something far worse. Shanice felt the familiar, suffocating weight of humiliation mix with fear, knotting in her stomach. She'd been in this position before, different faces, different circumstances, but always the same judgment. She wasn't just a person in Hardin's eyes. She was a problem to be dealt with, an outsider in a place where, to him, she didn't belong. Her hands trembled as she reached into her purse, pulling out her ID. She handed it to him, keeping her chin up, though every instinct told her to shrink under his withering gaze. But Hardin barely looked at the ID. He wasn't interested in facts. His attention was still on her, her skin, her presence, her very existence in this neighborhood. To him, the ID was just a formality, another useless piece of paper that didn't change his mind. The hostility in the air was thick, almost tangible, pressing down on Shanice. She could feel her children's eyes on her, watching, trying to make sense of what was happening. They were seeing the world as it truly was, and the thought made Shanice's heart ache. This wasn't just a moment of inconvenience, this was a lesson etched into their young minds of how people like them were treated. It was a cruel, painful truth they'd carry with them long after this moment passed. Her blood boiled with anger, but her fear for their safety kept it all locked inside. She swallowed her pride, biting back the urge to snap, to demand to know why she had to prove herself, why she had to justify her presence here. Instead, she played the part she'd played too many times before, the cooperative suspect, not because she was guilty of anything, but because she had two small lives depending on her to stay calm. Elijah stepped out of his car with a grace that seemed almost effortless, a subtle display of control that commanded attention. He adjusted his cufflinks, the smallest of gestures, but it felt deliberate, like a king preparing to address a subject. As he approached the scene, his presence became impossible to ignore. Unlike Hardin, who was desperately clinging to authority, Elijah didn't need to flaunt power. It radiated from him, quiet but undeniable. "Officer, is there an issue here?" Elijah's voice cut through the tense air like a knife, smooth and calm, but with an edge that demanded answers. His eyes locked onto Hardin's, unflinching, as if daring the officer to meet his gaze. Hardin, who just moments before had been the epitome of bravado, now hesitated. His aggression faltered as his brain caught up with the reality of who he was dealing with. Elijah Mercer wasn't just another bystander. His name was a force of its own, one that opened doors, swayed decisions, and, in moments like these, made grown men sweat. Hardin's bluster deflated visibly. His posture, which had been rigid with misplaced authority, slackened. "This lady's vehicle looks suspicious," Hardin muttered, but the confidence in his voice was gone, replaced with uncertainty. The words barely made it out of his mouth before he seemed to realize how hollow they sounded. He knew it wasn't the car he found suspicious, it was Shanice, her presence in a space he felt she didn't belong. But now, with eyes on him and cameras rolling, that thin veneer of justification was crumbling fast. Elijah didn't break his gaze, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Suspicious, you say? Funny, I bought this car for her last week." His words landed like a hammer, each syllable resonating with the gathered crowd. The statement was simple, but its impact was profound. It wasn't just a declaration of fact, it was a power move, one that exposed Harden's bias for what it truly was. The crowd, which had been buzzing with nervous murmurs, fell into an uneasy silence. The weight of the moment settled on everyone. Phones were raised, their screens capturing every second, every shift in the dynamic. Harden's face drained of color, a cold realization dawning on him. He wasn't just dealing with a random woman and her children anymore. He was facing Elijah Mercer, a man whose wealth and influence could bulldoze his entire career in an instant. He was cornered, and he knew it. Without breaking his calm demeanor, Elijah leaned in slightly, his voice lowering but gaining an unmistakable firmness. Now, unless you want to explain this to my lawyers and the media, I suggest you let them go. Immediately. There was no room for negotiation in his tone. It was a command, one that brooked no argument. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that Harden looked almost disoriented. His hand, which had been inching dangerously close to his holster just moments before, now retreated quickly, as though it had never belonged there in the first place. He took a step back, his bravado dissolving into embarrassment. The crowd, the phones, Elijah's unyielding gaze, it was all too much. With a weak nod, Harden muttered something under his breath, the words lost in the weight of his shame. He turned on his heel and shuffled back to his patrol car, his shoulders hunched, his cheeks burning with the knowledge that he had been thoroughly outmatched. Elijah watched him retreat, the calm smile never leaving his face. The silence that followed was deafening, the tension evaporating, replaced by a palpable sense of justice restored. Shanice, still holding her breath, finally exhaled. The terror that had gripped her moments ago began to fade, replaced with gratitude. Elijah hadn't just stepped in, he had dismantled the entire situation with a few carefully chosen words, shifting the narrative from one of fear to one of empowerment. Within hours, the video exploded across social media, shared and reshared by thousands. It wasn't just the sight of Elijah Mercer, a billionaire, stepping in to protect a mother and her children that captured the world's attention, it was how he did it. With calm, undeniable authority, he had stripped the power from a uniformed officer and exposed the ugly truth of racial profiling in broad daylight. It was a David and Goliath story with a twist. This time, Goliath had fought on the side of justice. The public response was immediate and intense. People were outraged, not just at Officer Harden, but at the system that had allowed this kind of behavior to thrive unchecked. Comment sections and news outlets buzzed with discussions about racial profiling and the everyday injustices faced by people of color, particularly in neighborhoods like the one Shanice had been in. Harden's face was plastered across headlines, and within days, he was placed under investigation. His once rigid authority now seemed fragile, as public pressure mounted and his actions were scrutinized. But Elijah wasn't interested in just dismantling Harden's career. He wanted to dismantle the whole broken system that had produced officers like him. Rather than let the incident fizzle out as a viral moment, Elijah seized the opportunity to create lasting change. He immediately funneled millions into local organizations dedicated to fighting racial injustice. Legal aid funds were set up to support victims of police misconduct and racial discrimination, ensuring that those without resources would still have access to powerful advocates in the courtroom. Elijah didn't stop there. He took aim at the root causes of the issue, investing heavily in community policing reforms. He worked with city officials to develop programs that would shift the culture within the police force, emphasizing de-escalation, accountability, and better training on implicit bias. He knew that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to start building the foundations for it now. His financial power became a tool for reshaping the community, transforming what had been a place of fear for many into a beacon of hope. Perhaps most impactful was his creation of scholarships for underprivileged youth, children like Ava and Malik, who had seen firsthand the ugliness of the world but also the power of standing up to it. These scholarships weren't just about education, they were about opportunity, giving young people the tools they needed to rise above the systemic barriers that had long kept their communities down. Shanice and her children were still shaken by the encounter. The fear and humiliation they had endured in those tense moments wouldn't disappear overnight. But they weren't broken. Thanks to Elijah's intervention, they had been spared a far worse outcome, and they now had a powerful ally in their corner. Elijah didn't just step in to help in that moment, he continued to protect them, making sure that no one else in their community would have to experience the same injustice again. What had begun as an ugly, familiar story of racial profiling had been transformed into something far greater. The viral video, once just a snapshot of prejudice in action, became a symbol of resistance and hope. Elijah's actions sent a clear message: power wasn't just about how much wealth you had, but about how you used it. He had chosen to wield his influence for good, not just by defending Shanice, but by investing in a future where no one else would have to fear being treated as less than because of the color of their skin. And in doing so, he had shown the world what true power looked like: compassionate, strategic, and unshakably just. The community, once marred by suspicion and inequality, began to heal. Hardin's downfall was a warning, and Elijah's commitment to change was a promise. What started as a nightmare had become a turning point, a reminder that justice didn't always come from the badge, it could come from the people who refused to stand by and watch injustice unfold.